Frances HATFIELD is a training analyst here at the C.G. Jung Institute of Santa Fe, where she serves as treasurer. She was trained and is a member of the C.G. Jung Institute of San Francisco, as well as the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts, IRSJA, where she also is a training analyst. She's a mother, she's a grandmother, she's a poet. She has a book of poems called Rudiments of Flight. She has a private practice in Santa Fe. And she's a friend. So I'm happy to introduce Frances HATFIELD. Please welcome Frances.
Frances,
Yeah, thank you, Rich. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And thank you, and thank Lisa for doing all the amazing things that you do to get these events put on. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for coming today, for spending part of your beautiful Saturday thinking about myths and stories with me. I appreciate you being here. And I'd like to begin by honoring and giving thanks to Gaia, this earth that sustains us, to the Tewa ancestors who lived on this land where I am anyway, before us, and named this place Oga-Poge. I know I didn't get that right. White Shell Water Place. We pray for the health and well-being of their descendants who still live here, for the health and well-being of all our relations, especially today the Ukrainians and all who are suffering because of war. If you had told me back when I was in graduate school that I would one day be giving a talk about Oedipus, I would have thought you were nuts. That was back in the days when I knew everything and I had an opinion about everything, whether I knew about it or not. And I took a great exception to how Freud took a bit of the myth of Oedipus and made this theory out of it, which left out so much. And, you know, psychology has moved on quite a bit since those days. And still, you know, a lot of people in the world think about Oedipus and they think about having erotic and competitive feelings about their parents. So, you know, isn't Oedipus like some kind of cliche now, or like a joke, like the one, the definition of a Freudian slip when you think one thing and say your mother. So why would we be wanting to talk about Oedipus? Well, along about the time the pandemic started to unfold, I was reminded of the pandemic that unfolded in Athens in about 430 BCE during a war when the city was crowded with refugees. And I was reminded that Sophocles' great play, Oedipus Tyrannus, was first, they believe, was first produced in about 425 BCE, which was shortly after the plague years when three surges of the plague had decimated the city and leading to its downfall as a superpower in the ancient world. So I went back and read the plays. There's actually a trilogy of them. And I realized that the myth of Oedipus has actually quite a lot to tell us about the age that we are in. And the Oedipus at Colonus, which was Sophocles' last play, has something important to tell us about a possible path into our future out of complete devastation. So today, that's what we're going to do. We're going to explore the myth of Oedipus, which is not only a kind of childhood dream of psychoanalysis, but it's also part of an archetypal pattern. It's kind of like a nested doll in a larger pattern expressed in ancient Greek myths that describe the creation of our current age. This is the part of the Orphic cosmogony. I will venture the view that Oedipus chose Freud, not the other way around, and that like any dream or myth that grips us, it meant far more than he could grasp. And that in a real way, Freud acted out Oedipus's ancestral curse for his time. And that Sophocles' Oedipus and Colonus hints at a path to the age to come. So I'm going to start. Let's see, is this the right one? Uh-oh, which one is it? Okay.
It was the PowerPoint 365.
I think that's that one, right?
Yeah.
Slideshow from beginning. Is
Yes.
that working?
Yeah, it's working.
All right. Okay. Did you get a new slide here?
Mhm.
Is it working right?
Yes, it is. It's working right.
Okay. Sophocles opens the play Oedipus Tyrannus on a scene of Oedipus at his palace, a throng of citizens begging his aid. They say, "The city is plunged headlong into the depths of disaster, engulfed by a murderous seething tide. Desolation wastes away the harvest, destroys our herds grazing in the fields, blights the women and makes them barren. Some furious god hurls pestilence and plague, draining the house of Cadmus, as Hades bloats on dirges of death." They remind Oedipus that his solving the riddle of the Sphinx, which had installed him as their king, had saved their lives and brought the city lucky signs and good days. And though he is not a god, that he understands divine power and knows what to do at such times. Thus they look to him as an oracle to make meaning of the calamity befallen them. In turn, an anguished Oedipus tells them he has sent for the only cure he knows, an oracle from Apollo's shrine at Delphi. Athens' plague and Sophocles' play happened at a time when faith in oracles and divine powers in general were being shaken and increasingly questioned. A personal relationship with gods inhabiting holy places on earth, maintained by ritual and sacrifice, was being replaced with gods as immortal, abstract powers largely indifferent to the plight of humans. The theme of the trustworthiness of oracles runs throughout Sophocles' Oedipus, and the chorus makes clear that if oracles are not true, faith in the gods is also mistaken. Thucydides, who lived through the plague and was considered our first scientific historian, was a chief proponent of the separation of logos from mythos and the superiority of the former over the latter. As Walter Burkert tells it, the word mythos is now redefined and devalued as the sort of story that the old poets used to tell and that old women still tell to children. In other words, the great myths, along with the gods, slowly became old wives' tales. 2,500 years later, we are the descendants of that profound split, which we now understand in part as the hemispheric lateralization of our brains with their vastly different ways of perceiving and comprehending the world. Hence, to quest after the meaning of a pandemic now, in the final days of Newtonian physics, is an even more fraught endeavor, On the one hand, there is our reasonable scientific left brain view of no meaning, a mindless virus with specific material causes and the senseless tragedy it wreaks. At the other end of the Newtonian causality spectrum, maybe the right brain, a quest for meaning gives us conspiracy theories. In a more quantum-leaning model of complex systems and emergence, we can see factors such as overpopulation, habitat destruction, climate change, and global predatory economic policies making of the planet a petri dish for calamity. This model enables us to contemplate meaning as teleological, a call to create a different future, to make what changes are needed to address our koyanaskatsi, life out of balance. But what about the question of meaning in an even larger sense? How has the king, the ruling principle or archetype of our age, led us into our current crisis of pollution, mass extinction, inequality, and a world on fire, in which a pandemic now unfolds? I think even asking this question is preposterous and grandiose. How can we know these things? And yet, if we do not venture to ask what ails the king, to borrow from another myth, and ask further, whom does the Grail, the work of human consciousness, serve? Are we Parsifal failing to ask the crucial question that could heal us? So I ask and I invite all of you to dream on this with me. For after all, is analytical psychology not the refuge of those who still believe in the veracity of mythos, in oracles? Though the oracle has moved from Delphi to that mysterious country called the unconscious, who believes more than we do, except for many indigenous people, of course, that the Pythian priestess still speaks to us in dreams, sending guidance and illumination in her own cryptic tongue. In the unus mundus, or unified field of consciousness, in which there are no accidents, the coronavirus is as much psyche as matter, emerging out of the heart of nature, Gaia, a pandemic brought by Pan. As we will see, Gaia herself initiated the development of consciousness that created the world we now inhabit. Though she no longer supports us, and she now calls us to transform ourselves yet again, to enter a new age. To understand this, we need to undertake an Ouroboros journey into our origins, to find out, like Oedipus, who our parents are. To find our future, then, we now turn to our past. The myth of Oedipus reaches back into prehistory. The Iliad, among the oldest works of Western literature, written down in the 8th century BCE, around there, mentions Oedipus's funeral rites as having occurred in the old days. In the Odyssey, Odysseus encounters the soul of Epicaste, or Jocasta, who in ignorance, this is a quote, translated quote, who in ignorance of mind did a monstrous deed and married her own son, who had killed his own father, and married her, and the gods at once made this well known to men. Odysseus describes how Jocasta hung herself, leaving Oedipus suffering greatly to rule, quote, through the fatal plans of gods, end quote, tortured by the Erinyes, or Furies, who uphold the natural and moral order and avenge crimes against the mother. From other sources comes the story that Oedipus was the victim of a family curse, that his father, Laius, had been raised by Pelops and had repaid the hospitality by kidnapping and raping Pelops' son, Chrysippus, making him, according to many, the originator of child sexual abuse, pederasty. Chrysippus killed himself in shame. Pelops cursed Laius, praying that he would either have no son or be killed by any son he did have. Laius went on to marry Jocasta and ascended to the throne of Thebes. Though Laius intended not to have children, he got drunk one night and fathered Oedipus. We know how that goes. Pelops' curse-turned oracle was then said to be the reason Laius decided to murder his son by having him exposed on a mountain to die. And that's the cause, of course, of Oedipus's ignorance of his parentage. However, as Carl Karenyi points out, Laius's anxiety lest he be dethroned by his son needed no oracle, for its prototype was found in the history of the gods, in the tale of Ouranos and Kronos, a very ancient tradition common to the Greeks and the Asians from an early date. To understand Oedipus's ancestral lineage then, and his context in the history of consciousness, we must go back to the birth of our age in the myths of Ouranos and Gaia, Kronos and Rhea, and Zeus and Hera, to which we now turn. The Orphic cosmogony was recited as part of the Orphic mystery rites for over 1,000 years. It is the origin story of Western civilization. Well, it's one of them. It's for Northern Europeans. They have some others, but this is a big one. It is a story of the evolution of consciousness from the Big Bang up to our present day, the final days of the age of Zeus. The Orphics integrated the Greek creation myths with those of the indigenous people, the Pelasgians, starting with the emergence of Faunus Dionysus out of the cosmic egg, which they called the first Orphic age. We might think of the breaking of the cosmic egg as the Big Bang that began the process of creation and consciousness in the universe. We can also think of this as a micro process in which consciousness emerges in each of us, moment by moment, endlessly creating the world we experience. Isn't she beautiful? In this way, Gaia, the earth, and Ouranos, the cosmos, are created and come to rule the second Orphic age. All of earthly life is engendered by the marriage of Gaia and Ouranos. Ouranos is a vector for our experience of cosmos as divinity and our experience of ourselves as part of that divinity. In the Orphic mysteries, a sort of password used by the initiates was, I am a son or daughter of earth and starry heaven. My friends, here are our parents. They not only created humans and all living beings on this earth, they go on creating us moment by moment. They are making love in our bodies incessantly. It is called breathing. They are bringing us forth into being at every moment. In his book, The Dream of the Earth, Thomas Berry reminds us that our bonding with the larger dimensions of the universe comes about primarily through our genetic coding. It is the determining factor. It provides constant guidance in the organic functioning that takes place in all our sense functions, in our capacity for transforming food into energy, in our thought, imaginative, and emotional life. In a particular manner, the genetic coding brings about a healing whenever we sustain any physical injury. Our genetic coding enables us to experience joy and sorrow on appropriate occasions. It provides the ability to speak and think and create. It establishes the context of our relation with the divine. Our visionary power is expressed most profoundly when we are immersed in the depths of our own being and of the cosmic order itself in the dream world that unfolds within us in our sleep, or in those visionary moments that seize upon us in our waking hours. If our daytime experience is needed for awakening to the phenomenal world, our nighttime experience is needed for communion with those numinous powers from which the daylight forms themselves come into being. In the age of Ouranos and Gaia, in terms of the evolution of consciousness, an initial separation of sky and earth has been achieved. But the continual lapse of consciousness back into its source is portrayed by Ouranos stuffing his children back into a nether region of the mother called Tartarus, our proto-unconscious. So I will be bringing these myths in to talk about neurology and the development of consciousness in us over time, like from children, and also as micro processes going on right now. So put on your mythopoetic thinking caps if you haven't already. Gaia, uncomfortable with the growing crowd in her Tartarus, induces her son Colonus, Saturn, to castrate his father using a type of sickle used in ancient times for gelding livestock. That it is Gaia who initiates the solution to stalemate and provides the tools indicates that the power of directing the development of consciousness is the earth itself, herself, shaping human evolution at every stage. Gaia, who directed all our developments in consciousness, apparently intended that humans evolve egos or an ability to separate from the oceanic cosmic unconscious so that a new development, a child, needed to take over. Uranus' sperm are spilled over the ocean, symbolizing the marriage of the starry heavens and the fertile earth, the oceanic world. Out of this union arises Aphrodite, or Venus. This suggests to us the ensouling of matter and the embodiment of the higher mind, with heaven and earth as equal participants of the same indissoluble whole. In astrology, the planet Venus symbolizes our values as well as our desire for connection and beauty. The reign of Rhea, whose name means the flowing one, and Saturn or Kronos, the third Orphic age, marks the emergence of a new consciousness of time, Chronos, out of timelessness, Ion, or timeless time, a sense of world and self persisting over time. In child development, this is object constancy and the emergence of a proto-ego, an I. Consciousness persisting over time gives us sustained focus and a perception of development and right timing, the tracking of seasons and the growth of crops in agriculture, or the awareness of one's life having a trajectory of growth, maturity, and decline. In the age of Saturn, we see the evolution of structures of knowledge and tradition called the nomos, laws based on custom, tradition, and reverence for divine powers present in nature. The nomos were personified by the goddesses Themis and Dike, and their masculine counterpart, the nomos theos, which was a title that was applied to Pan, Dionysus, and Hermes. The use of the sickle to castrate Ouranos suggests the restraint and transformation of human aggression and libido, as hunters became herdsmen and increasingly larger and more complex social systems required new levels of cooperation and collaboration. Inherent in the meaning of limits and restraint imposed by the nomos is sacrifice. A profound understanding of the meaning and necessity of sacrifice evolved with consciousness itself, the sacred mystery of life giving itself to life, death making new life possible. Every sacrificial animal was divine. The progenitor of Christ as the Lamb of God was the god Dionysus, present in the sacrificial calf or goat, as well as in wine, which also signifies the mysteries of transubstantiation. Out of an understanding of sacrifice, rites of initiation evolved, the sacrifice of an old self for a new, a near-death ordeal, opening consciousness to a perception of a larger order and one's place in it. Pubescent initiation rites transformed a child into a responsible adult, interconnected in community. In later mystery rites, we transformed one's identity in relation to a larger order, in this life and in the next. In the ancient world, the planet Colonus, the planet Saturn, Colonus, was the outermost known planet, signifying structure, order, fate, and limits, including death, the portal through which the soul passed into the realm of its cosmic source. Colonus, rather than stuffing his children back into the mother, swallows them himself. This suggests the inhibition of consciousness, perception, feeling, thought, by a dominant ruling awareness. New developments in consciousness, children, are restricted or swallowed, inhibited by the given order. Here we see one dimension of the senex puer polarity, tradition that inhibits innovation. It is an evolutionary paradoxical impasse in which an increasing power of consciousness prevents new consciousness. Our habits of thought prohibit new insights or new ways of seeing. Euripides expressed this impasse in a song of the chorus of the Bacchae, praising the old virtues of humility and reverence for the gods, singing, "Beyond the old beliefs, no thought, no act shall go." Like Gaia outsmarting Uranus, Rhea conceives a solution to these impediments to progress by giving Colonus a stone to eat in place of the infant Zeus, who is then hidden away in a Cretan cave and raised in secret. Here, the new god Zeus is melded with Dionysus, the primordial god of ancient Crete and surrounding areas. Historically, this reflects a synthesis of Indo-European and pre-Greek indigenous people and gods. The goddesses teach Zeus how he can rule the world in a new way. Zeus takes over the world in several different ways. First, he swallows the entire order of gods before him. He doesn't just swallow his children, he swallows his ancestors and the whole primordial universe created by Faunus Dionysus. And then he inherits both the scepter of Faunus Dionysus and Uranus's thunderbolt. Second, in an alternative version, Zeus uses his thunderbolt to roast the forests and boil the oceans to conquer his ancestors and their world and banish them to Tartarus. Gaia objects to this, but Zeus overrules her. The swallowing, destruction, and banishment of the old gods and their order point to a violent severance of psyche into conscious and unconscious. A strengthening of the ego to superhero god status to rule consciousness on the one hand, and a corresponding pull of the unconscious, suppressed by the force of the ego. This new interiority contains the archetypes of the collective unconscious, banishes them to darkness, and supports an ever-growing polarization between conscious ego and unconscious. Power. Zeus's chief attribute is enthroned as the ruling principle of humankind, and it is grounded on the power to split itself off from its source, to go unconscious, to swallow and control awareness. This paradigm shift is a revolutionary transformation and reordering of our reality at every level, a paradigm that still dominates our consciousness. We will now look at how the mythic expression of this revolution in consciousness parallels the evolution of brain structures that attended it. In the axial age, approximately 900 to 300 BCE and forward, the increasing separation of logos and mythos is attended by the increasing lateralization of the brain's hemispheres and their attendant functions, and the hyperdevelopment and growing dominance of the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere is what rules the right side of the body. The invention of alphabetic writing has spurred this hyperdevelopment and dominance. As visual focus, figure versus ground, is key to reading, and alphabetic letters are also key to human-made sounds. These two features together lift language out of its pictographic and oral connections to nature and mythos to make it self-referential, independent of nature, and capable of abstraction, logos. This is mythically expressed by Zeus's slaying of the dragon Typhon or Typhus, who had 100 heads and spoke in the voices of all the gods and animals. Thereafter, we gradually lost the capacity to hear the vast intelligence outside us as nature or inside our own embodied depths. Oedipus's ancestor Cadmus, who brought the Phoenician alphabet to Greece, also slew a dragon and was instructed to bury its teeth, from which armed men sprang up and fought each other until only 5 remained, the Spartoi, who founded Oedipus's house of Thebes. Leonard Schlein points out that the number of letters in our alphabet is approximately the same as our number of teeth, and that metaphorically, letters perform the same function. Writing can tear the wholeness of nature into small bites, he says. Thus, the alphabet appropriates our mythopoetic means of grasping reality, the dragon's teeth, for the new logos. Fighting men springing up from the teeth of a dragon sacred to Ares, the god of war, also suggests the violence and aggression that attends the arrival of the alphabet. The ability to focus on text, to sever figure from ground, is part of the power to dismember the world. This violence, which we have also seen in Zeus's use of the thunderbolt, is an agent of consciousness and of destruction. This accords with the fact that our experience of anger and aggression is tied to the left hemisphere, while grief and other emotions are connected with the right. Generations of the house of Cadmus, including Oedipus, will be riven by violence. Schlein tracks the eruption of violence that accompanied the spread of literacy throughout European history with such events as the invention of the printing press. As we will explore below, Dionysus will carry the shadow projection of this violence, as will women, children, and the alien other. Western cultural history has conceived of the domains of our 2 brain hemispheres as the Dionysian and the Apollonian, most famously articulated by Nietzsche, whose views profoundly influenced Freud and Jung. Both are sons of Zeus, but Dionysus, as Faunus, is also Zeus's creator, the source of consciousness itself. The right hemisphere, which gathers the vast intelligence of the body in its profound immersion in the unus mundus, heart, viscera, vagal system, autonomic nervous system, is key to music, relationship, emotion, except for anger, empathy, nonverbal communication, metaphor, context, nuance, humor, irony. It tells us what things mean and why they matter, which can only be known by how they connect. Dionysus naturally carries the functions and meaning of this foundation of cosmic consciousness and related brain structures and spinal cord. The many festivals and rites of worship of Dionysus, involving dance, poetry, theater, wine, harvest, and initiation, among them rites in which celebrants became the god, all point to this body of wisdom and knowledge and the need to ritually remember the dismembered god as the body of the unus mundus. The left hemisphere, in contrast, has the power to dismember, to abstract. Its power in comprehending and producing language is to represent, in which signs are substituted for experience. Though it is commonly thought that the left has language and the right does not, language is actually a more complex collaboration of the special skills of each hemisphere, as are most of the functions of consciousness. An important feature of this relationship is the power of the left hemisphere to inhibit the right, including the occlusion, ignoring, not seeing, of the left visual and somatosensory field, to make up answers for what the right hemisphere perceives, and to be certain that it's right. In other words, the left hemisphere's power to dominate consciousness lies in its power to inhibit the input of the right, and or to appropriate that input to fit into its own definitions of the world, and to enforce those definitions as truth. The solar god Apollo fittingly portrays not only the brilliant powers of consciousness brought by the development of the left hemisphere, but its growing domination in how we create and know our world in the age of Zeus. That he is also a god of culture, healing, prophecy, and music is due mainly to appropriation from older gods, just as the left hemisphere appropriates the input of the right. For instance, he took over the oracle at Delphi, a site of goddess worship back into Neolithic times, by slaying her dragon son Python, who was also identified with Dionysus. Of the many stories of Apollo and Dionysus at Delphi, an important one for our understanding of how consciousness works in the age of Zeus is that Dionysus was buried at the site of the Omphalos, the navel of the world, either after Zeus had incinerated him with the Titans or after Apollo killed him. The better known story is that the dragon Python was buried there. Thereafter, the solar god Apollo ruled the summer Delphic rites, while Dionysus ruled the winter, returning to, quote, preside over the cries of the night. This is a picture I took of the Corcyrian cave that's above Delphi. So this was the site of the goddess. At the holy burial site of the god dragon, vapors issued from the earth, which the Pythoness breathed in to receive prophecies from Gaia and Python Dionysus. And though by Sophocles' time it was known that the oracle could be corrupted to support the emerging patriarchal order, it is this oracle to which Oedipus and all the ancient world for millennia turned for truth. Thus, the intelligence of the right hemisphere, our embodied, related, interconnected dragon intelligence, is not eliminated by Zeus's swallowing and roasting and Apollo's dragon slaying. It rather falls into its shadow, becomes vapor, is buried in the earth unconscious, or cannibalized and adapted for use by the dominant paradigm of consciousness. The boundary between conscious and unconscious is not a clear or fixed one, as we know. It is fluid. It is a fluid kaleidoscope. What is privileged in consciousness becomes tied to a specific kind of language based in logos, but our ecstatic embodied depths still express their mythos through other means, as all clinicians and students of consciousness know. As Bessel van der Kolk says, the body keeps the score. To become immortal, to create the ideal, independent, deathless hero ego, Zeus must interrupt the infinite incarnation, death, and renewal of the divine in nature. In other words, he must dismember time and the entire mythopoetic interconnected world. To do this, he must not only swallow the past, slay the father, but also arrest his ongoing initiation or incarnation into the future, slay his son. This is accomplished in a series of steps. First, the divine child Dionysus is reborn when Zeus mates with his mother, Rhea, by force, and then his daughter, Persephone. So we see here the Oedipus pattern of killing off the father and then mating with the mother, raping the mother. When this divine child Dionysus is playing with his toys, the Titans steal back from Tartarus to perform the sacrificial rites on the god, which are the essence of Dionysus, as the divinity endlessly dying and being reborn, streaming through all of creation. He was the immanent God, not the abstract God. It is this Godhead, immanent in all creation, which Zeus must destroy. So Zeus incinerates the Titans in the act of sacrificing this child. I don't have any images of that because it was unspeakable, it was irrepresentable. It's the deepest mystery, the dismemberment of the god. Zeus incinerates the Titans. He rescues, or rather Athena rescues, the heart of Dionysus, atomizes it, and gives it to Semele in a drink to impregnate her for a second birth. Semele is an earth goddess turned mortal princess. And after Zeus ascends to Olympus, his marriage to Hera, who he brings with him to be an abstract goddess, is sterile. So he has to mate with Earth. He has to come to Earth somehow in order to have any children at all. When she is 7 months pregnant, she is then roasted and the fetus sewn into Zeus's thigh. Of course, it's blamed on Hera, but that's a feature of the pattern, is to blame it on others. The god is then born to Zeus a third time as an immortal. You see the little Dionysus there holding the cantharis, the wine cup. While the soot and ashes of the Titans who had eaten of him, since he is immortal, even as soot, are the stuff of which humans are made. That's us. In this way, Zeus, our archetype of human sovereignty, has extracted himself from matter, from the feminine, from his past, and from his future, to become immortal. An additional meaning of this myth of Zeus roasting the Titans as they sacrificed Dionysus has to do with initiation. Jane Ellen Harrison was the first to see the connection between the Titans, whose name means white clay men, with the initiators in some indigenous cultures. In interrupting this initiation in order to extract the divine from creation, Zeus also changes the meaning of hero, which once meant an initiated man. The new ideal masculine hero is one who does not have to suffer limits because others can be made to suffer them for him. As the world became to be increasingly split by our left hemispheric powers of literacy into a duality of abstract and literal, we and all of nature are also increasingly split between an immortal abstract spirit and a literal corrupt body, with no means for transubstantiation, no mythopoetic space to participate in divine life's cycles of birth and death. For instance, the rites of Dionysus, where we became the god in ecstatic dancing, became obsolete, because then there's no possibility, if the divine is abstract up there and we are down here, it becomes obsolete to think of ourselves as being able to become God. As a story about brain development, so we're shifting our focus here a bit, Zeus's roasting of his child's successor Dionysus in the act of being sacrificed and eaten by the Titans pictures the massive pruning of neural connections which occurs around 4 to 6 years of age. Developmentally, the child loses the direct perception and understanding of the dances of the ancestors, the ancestral traumas encoded in the embodied unconscious of its parents. The ego, the micro-god of the self, gains a new opacity and resistance to fragmentation, leaving behind the mythopoetic world of monsters under the bed, to enter the land of concrete operations and literacy. With the fragmentation of god Dionysus into an abstract Olympian and the soot of the Titans, our gods are rendered into mute physical symptoms, soot, and abstract ideals, Olympians. As an archetypal pattern maintaining the rule of Zeus and Apollo, this is the ongoing subjection and banishment of our embodied intelligence and our hunger for communion in a divine world to the unconscious. Collectively and culturally, it is the institution of patriarchy, the enthronement of an ideal of the independent, deathless hero, uninitiated and extracted from responsibility to community, who has no need to sacrifice because others, specifically women, children, the earth, and the alien other conceived as primitive, animal, or childlike, are mandated by written laws to sacrifice and suffer for him. This paves the way for genocide, imperialism, environmental holocaust, and patriarchal misogyny. And my colleague Gil Dudley is going to present next month on patriarchal, on toxic masculinity and these things. We are ruled by Zeus, but made of the soot of the Titans, containing the god of infinite life. We compulsively, unconsciously repeat the ancestral crime and trauma, the involuntary sacrifice, scapegoating of women, children, the alien other, the earth, and our own embodied intelligence, the body of need and desire to remember the God of infinite life. This kind of unholy sacrifice no longer remembers the God to us and thus becomes repetition compulsion, endless war, endless fragmentation and exploitation of our world and ourselves. Let's see where I am in time. I promise I'm going to stop and give us time to talk. Okay. The disappearance of our ancestral traumas into the unconscious is reflected in Sophocles' Oedipus, to whom we now turn, who unknowingly carries the ancestral crimes of parricide, infanticide, and incest. As we have seen, these are the ancestral crimes by which our age was created by Zeus. Moreover, by Zeus's swallowing of the gods, Oedipus also carries personal responsibility, no longer carried by the gods. As we will see, Freud's Oedipus will carry the same crimes, but reduced even further to soot, literal biology, and the deathless God as theory, abstract principle. "400 years after the Iliad and the Odyssey's mention of Oedipus, the tragedians of classical Athens have not tired of telling his story, though Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannus is the most well-known. Essential to the dramatic structure and emotional impact of the story is Oedipus's not knowing and gradual discovery of who he is, who his parents are. Oedipus will find his way by unconscious acts of parricide and incest to rule Thebes. He thus portrays the tragic dilemma of our age. Having forgotten our ancestors, our home in a divine cosmos, in our own embodied depths, for the sake of a new ego consciousness, we are blinded to who and what we are by that very consciousness. Our ancestral crimes and traumas will be acted out blindly as fate. In Sophocles' Oedipus, the family curse is not remarked. On the contrary, one of his significant innovations in the story is that Oedipus is the bearer of his own curse, not the family curse, and the pain he takes on is his own. While he will later, in Oedipus at Colonus, protest his ignorance of his crime and the injustice of it, he still accepts and bears the suffering entailed by his actions, and he will be transformed by that suffering. Sophocles' second innovation, as Woodruff notes, is to cast Oedipus as the chief investigator and witness in his own case. We will recall that in Homer's 8th century, 300 years before Sophocles, it is the gods who reveal Oedipus's and Jocasta's crime. But in the 5th century, the gods are not heard directly much anymore, having begun their lapse into the unconscious. Oedipus must discover the truth himself. The dramatic action of Sophocles' tragedy is Oedipus's relentless pursuit of the truth to relieve his people's suffering. His quest for truth sets him apart from most tyrants and kings in Attic tragedy who are, quote, slaves to their appetites for money and sex and power, end quote. What drives Oedipus is a passionate desire for knowledge. This passion for knowledge, befitting an heir of Cadmus as alphabet bringer in both its enlightening and violent aspects, makes him a poignant symbol of the evolution of consciousness. By solving the riddle of the Sphinx, he comes to have the power of an oracle for his people, as we have noted. The riddle itself points to the mystery of human evolution. What goes on 4 legs, then 2, then 3, and curiously is also resonant with Jung's formulation of the ages. The 4, our original unity, the 2, a split into opposites, and finally a reconciliation of the opposites in the 3rd. We'll talk more about Jung's idea about the ages a little later. The name Oedipus, quote, resonant with strange meanings, end quote. I think I'm quoting Paul Woodruff here, combines the 2 most prominent features of the human species. We are intelligent and we walk on 2 feet. At the end of his name, we hear dipus, 2-footed, a word from the riddle, while the beginning of his name sounds the root of the word for eyewitness knowledge, oid, a theme that echoes throughout the play. The Sphinx, whose riddle Oedipus guesses, that earns him his crown, was said to be a man-strangler sent by Hera to Thebes to haunt and punish Laius for his crime of molesting Chrysippus, and in this way is related to the Furies. In a play by Euripides, she is addressed as Earth's offspring, monster's child, half a maiden, fearful beast, who snatched the youths from Dirce's plain, crying the Furies' shriek. We will recall that 400 years earlier, Odysseus reports that the Furies hounded Oedipus after his marriage to his mother came to light. That he outwitted his father's fury by guessing the riddle, only to be haunted by his own, says something of the intractable nature of ancestral crimes, which we encounter in therapeutic practice every day. To go back before Laius, one story of the curse on the royal house of Thebes is that when Cadmus slew the water dragon at the spring sacred to Ares, the war god was outraged and put a curse on Cadmus's descendants. This would be another way of expressing the ongoing violence that attended the revolutionary fragmentation of the world into a duality of abstract and literal, brought by literacy. When Oedipus and Laius, who both had a violent temper, encountered each other as strangers at the crossroads, they were both headed to the same place, the oracle at Delphi, to find truth. Neither would give way to the other. Violence ensued. The rest, as they say, is history. 1,500 years later, another ambitious quester after consciousness would also find himself at a crossroads where Oedipus waited for him. That's our cliffhanger. I want to stop here. And let me see. I'm going to stop share for now. Stop share. And I would love to, I know this is a lot that I just whisked through here, but I'd like to open us to some discussion. And then after that, we'll take a short break, and then we'll do the same thing. We'll shampoo, rinse, repeat. I'll talk some more, and then we'll talk some more. Okay. But I'd love to hear from you all.
Thanks, Frances. So again, if you'd like to have a question or say something, either use the reaction to raise your hand or type something in the chat, but let us know. And wonderful so far. Thank you, Frances. You know, Frances, I was struck just particularly in this last bit, just about what's going on with Ukraine right now, some of those same patterns. And I wonder if you might speak a little bit to what you're seeing as you've been kind of working with this myth. Do you also, are you struck at this time at the nature of what's going on with that?
Oh, so much. It's just heartbreaking. Well, that would be a presentation in itself. But, you know, the rise of autocratic leaders is definitely connected with our loss of the father. So people have a great nostalgia for a great father to restore order, to help them know their place in the universe, to help order things. So when Zeus swallowed Colonus, he's swallowing, he's taking over and putting over everything, the principle of power as the highest principle. All of what we once knew and wanted as what Colonus, what Saturn represents, structure, order, the good father, and the cosmic, the father who, you know, connects us with the cosmos. And the gradual deterioration and loss of the father, which is especially acute in this country. But of course, you know, we're not the only people who've had an autocratic leader recently. Leaves people at the mercy of these autocratic leaders. So this is the pinnacle of the power, of the power principle, and it's because of the military industrial complex, its ability to set fire to the planet, to take over the world, to buy more tanks, more artillery, and to just run it all over.
Yeah, that's really, I really appreciate the way you bring it in and talk about the power. I was reading an article this past week by Bayo Okomolafi, who's also a Jungian, who was talking about the power dynamic, basically kind of the archetypal within Russia and how Putin's doing that. So it really aligns with what you just said.
Wow, would you put the name of that person in the chat?
Yeah, I'll put the name and a link to that article too. There's a question in the chat from Candida Jones, and she asks, is there a correlation between the rise of the patriarchy and power to the loss of the truth? If so, can you address any developmental neurological changes that could account for the psychopathology so rampant today?
Candida, could you say something more about the loss of the truth?
And if
And
you
what-
want to unmute and speak, that would be fine too.
Yes, hi. What I'm suggesting is that it seems that with the so-called meritocracy, which actually isn't that at all, we see psychopaths in power, like Putin, Trump, and the like. And this seems to be correlated with the patriarchy. And so my question is simply, was there something that occurred neurobiologically in our so-called evolution that could account for what I see to be a rise in lying, basically, or a lack of morality? We know that's true with psychopaths. So they do have different genes in addition to environmental issues. And so I'm just curious, you're talking about the shift from the right to the left brain as the alphabet came into view, et cetera, if there isn't some kind of correlation, or perhaps there isn't. That's my question.
That's a great question. That's a really great question. So what occurs to me in the moment is that at that critical place where alphabetic writing and enabled people to begin to enabled men basically to part ways with Thebes and Dike, the law of reality, of the natural order of things, and to basically laws became things you wrote, things on the books. So alphabetic writing permitted law because Zeus became known as the nomos theos in the age of Zeus, but these laws are no longer based in reality. So whereas the more embodied laws would say, no, you can't hunt more than a certain amount. You can't rape the soil. You can't make dams until all the fish die. You have limits in what you can do. And that, I think, is the truth that we lost when laws became just what's written down on the books. Because what's written down in the books, you can change that. You can make it illegal. You can say that certain people are not human beings. You can say, of course, women can't vote. You can manipulate truth all kinds of ways when you have alphabetic writing. And then that's just a short step to there not being any kind of truth at all. Because, you know, I mean, when I was growing up, Walter Cronkite, for instance, was the definition of the bearer of truth. You know, there was this kind of still faith in that the news was based on real stuff, but the multiplicity, the way that the endless fragmentation of our entire existence has basically made truth, our truth, into these fragments and bits of information streaming through our devices. And that permits the rule of power to be supreme because you can manipulate all of that. You can be, whoever's most powerful decides what's true, basically. I don't know, does that answer your?
That's fantastic. It's like a continuation of the technological dissociation process allows for lying to rise.
Yeah.
And we see people's attention spans diminished. So
Yes.
that is changing the brain, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that goes into territory.
Mhm.
We could spend another few hours on that.
Thank you so much, Frances.
There's another question in the chat from Marjorie Runyon. You said we must discover who our parents are. Do we begin with social history and recognizing our parents as flawed? How does mythos help us as therapists to allow this discovery?
Another wonderful question. How does mythos help us?
as therapists
as therapists.
to allow this discovery? I guess she's asking, how do we begin?
Well, just being a Jungian leaning therapist already helps you. Because Freud, contemporary psychoanalysis, Freud didn't believe much in history. And Jung was famous for being all about history. He said, for instance, we are not of today or yesterday. We are of an immense age. And of course, his way of thinking was really huge. He did talk about in the, let's see, the father and the destiny of the individual. He does trace how in these different cases, the father or the parents set these patterns that people are just blindly living out until they become conscious. So in my practice, I absolutely not only want to know a lot about the parents, but I want to know about the grandparents and the great-grandparents. Because there's often a lot of ancestral trauma that can be showing up in symptoms, in the children acting out, in the nightmares, in the actual kind of patterns and themes that emerge in the therapy. We are suffering from our ancestral traumas, and also suffering from what they were not able to accomplish in this life that was given them to do. We are handed on their struggles. As Jung said, I feel like I'm working out a question that my great-grandfather was trying to work out. So I think it's of immense help to us to know how the ancestral traumas express themselves mythopoetically. Mythopoetically is through feelings in your body and your dreams and your nightmare. I mean, dreaming is nothing but mythopoetic, right? It just is not much logic in dreams. So it's all tied together very intimately. Does that address the question, Marjorie?
Yes, I've been working a lot, going back and back and back as far as I can go with my clients, and I'm finding the archetypal patterns way back.
Yes.
In the grandparents, great-grandparents, the migration story, how they came here, what they suffered.
Yes.
It oftentimes arises in the suffering of the great-grandparents and grandparents. Am I correct in that, Frances?
Yes, yes, absolutely. And in early childhood, that idea of the dances of the ancestor, the parents are dancing the dances of the ancestors for the child. And that, if that doesn't make too much sense, the advances in neurobiology and being able to look at those videos of a mother with an infant and how attachment styles arise, you can see that is the dances of the ancestors. Mothers learn their insecure attachment styles from their mothers and their mothers and their mothers. And so that is how the dancing is the neurobiology, how we are, and it starts when we're in the womb. It starts way early. So.
Yes, excuse me. I've been studying twins also, and so speaking of attachment in the womb, I'm not sure why twins arise. Is there some mythopoetic causation, I guess one could say, or arising of the phenomenon of twins? And that's my last question.
Well, you could probably answer this better. I mean, that's an extra dimension of complexity, isn't it? And there are a lot of myths about twins, but they not only have a mother that they're attached and connecting to, but they have a sibling right there in the womb. And, you know, often babies, you could see in the psyche and the dreams and so on, a kind of missing element or kind of grief or a something. And then the person finds out that they had a twin that died in the womb and was never born or something like that. It's
Yeah.
all,
The vanishing twins. Mhm.
that's all recorded in our mythopoetic biological selves.
There's one other question here in the chat. This is from Susan McDuffie. It's true that alphabetic writing, etc., can be manipulated and it can be fragmenting. Yet without that capacity, we would not even be having this presentation and discussion at all.
Yeah.
And the two hemispheres of the brain do work together in tandem to process information. It's not just one or the other. Could you comment on that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I know, you know, if I'm ever talking to neuropsychologists, neurobiologists, they just go crazy when I talk about this stuff because so the book that I drew a lot of thinking about this was Ian McGilchrist's The Master and His Emissary. And I know a lot of science has happened since then, but it's true, as you're absolutely right, Susan, that we have this marvelous thing called the corpus callosum, which I left out the story about how Athena was born when Zeus got a tremendous headache after he swallowed everything, and Hephaestus had to come along with a axe and split his head open. And if that isn't a great picture of the hemispheric lateralization, I don't even know what it is. But then Athena sprang forth. She had been in Medus's womb, who was swallowed by Zeus, and she was born. And I think she's our corpus callosum, that she's the one who puts it all together. And this is the marvelous thing about being human. And I totally agree with you that there's something, it's so brilliant what our minds, what our intelligence has been able to do. I have no argument with that. The problem is, just like with the age of Uranus and the age of Colonus, an impact, we get to an impasse because the development has gone as far as it can go, and something new has to happen to reorganize it so that things don't completely, in this case, so that we don't completely blow it and disappear from the earth. If I can make that connection, it's not that development is so bad. It's brilliant. It's wonderful. It's that we forgot the other play, the other side. You know, a lot of the earlier scientists researching the brain functions, they thought the right brain didn't do anything, that it was just stupid, you know, that it didn't know language and it was just dumb. And they didn't realize until much later that, you know, the right brain, without the right brain, we couldn't understand a joke, we couldn't understand poetry or music or anything. That it takes them together. So it's not the function itself, it's that it went so far towards dismemberment, disintegration, fragmentation, without us coming back to remembering how to remember, how to come back to our souls, to our mythopoetic souls. That's the critical issue right now. Does that agree? Do you agree, Susan?
Yeah, it seems in a way it's also just ego without any empathy. You know, ego without the the connection, there's the corpus callosum right there. But, you know, you could see it as just unbridled ego without any empathy or connection to others. That's kind of how I see it.
Right, left brain dominant ego specifically.
Yeah, but I still feel like the two, you can have empathy. It's kind of the left brain, but I guess I also feel like it's a function of both hemispheres. I guess I don't see it as that divided in a way. I mean, ego is.
Well,
I don't know. I'm not expressing this very well, but I guess you could say that ego was all left brain, but I think there's still ego wants things, ego desires things, senses
yes,
things,
yes, yeah.
and that might be a little more right brained. I don't they use that right brain to increase that separation. It's all I feel like the two are very connected, but I definitely see that fragmentation is what divides people off from I mean, I totally agree with you there.
Yes, yes. Yeah, ego isn't a specific left brain thing. Of course it's not. But empathy is key to the right hemisphere in general. And the left hemisphere is more able to distinguish things, to separate things, basically.
Yes.
And lack of empathy. I think that I know that there are particular areas in the brain that are, there are particular kinds of configurations of brain function that show up in scans in sociopathic people.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not a brain scientist, so I can't go into that.
Neither am I. Well, thank you.
Okay, we have one more question. Margaret Bloom says, brain functioning occurs and may be in part determined in social contexts, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely, down to the bottom. I mean, the first social context we have is inside the womb, right? There really isn't any separation. We are embedded in the context of the universe from the very first minute, second of life, as I was showing in the slides. I love that. There's that slide of the egg and the sperms all around it, and then the earth with satellites and the space junk all around it. Like from the beginning, we are in a context, and our learning happens in a context, whether we're talking about our parents or the larger family, our ancestors, our socioeconomic, it all happens in context. That was the fiction of that previous of Newtonian physics, that were these sort of discrete atoms knocking around and nothing has anything to do with anything. It's all quantum, really. I know I'll get into trouble saying that. All the physicists, I'll get in trouble with the neuroscientists when I talk about brain function. And if I mention the word quantum, I'm in trouble, but I'm using it anyway, in a mythopoetic sense.
There was that idea that we're tabula rasas, we come in as blank slates, and Jung challenged that, right? He said we come in with stuff, we come in with something, archetypal inheritance, perhaps ancestral inheritance, and capacities, but they don't always get to develop. Like a baby that's left alone and ignored doesn't develop its intelligence. That's very well studied.
Yeah.
It's in the relationship to the parent, mother, or others that we develop.
Yeah. Yeah, and in therapy too, there was that beginning, that tabula rasa idea with the therapist too, right? The therapist is just,
Right.
Nothing going on here.
Well, Freud sort of postulated that we should be just neutral blank slates.
Yeah, but but Jung finally came to alchemy as saying, guess what? You are in the soup with your analysand. no way to be out of it if you want any change to happen at all. If one person changes, the other person has to change. So there is no tabula rasa. What the hell is that anyway? Who made that up?
Sounds like some Latin person.
Yeah, right.
Living on them. Should we take a break?
Let's take a break. How long
So-
should we take a? Welcome back, everybody. I wish we could take regular music breaks, but I understand there's issues with
Copyright.
Copyright. Yeah, exactly.
In the recording.
Wish we could do the whole thing in music, actually. Okay. All right. Freud and Oedipus. Let me start my share screen again. And it's that one. And it's this. Oh, wait. Took me back to the beginning from current slide. Well, slideshow. So, oh, here we are, the current slide.
Very good.
Okay. Freud and Oedipus. Here's our guy. In April of 1896, Sigmund Freud read a paper entitled The Etiology of Hysteria before the Society for Psychiatry and Neurology in Vienna. In it, he proposed that hysteria was caused by actual events of child sexual abuse. This revolutionary seduction theory, as it was called, in essence, threatened to expose the ancestral crimes underpinning the rule of Zeus, the sacrifice and scapegoating of children and women for the sake of patriarchal power. Not surprisingly, his paper and its subsequent publication was received with a deafening silence. Somewhere in those long nights when Freud stood on a precipice looking down on oblivion, I like to imagine how Oedipus came to him, like a vapor from Apollo's oracle, speaking a riddle he had to solve. And when his seduction theory, over those long months, appeared poised to kill off his career, his future as the father of psychoanalysis, didn't its abandonment seem a small sacrifice? Or even if not small, one he was helpless not to make? Freud rejected the seduction theory in favor of the Oedipus complex, according to Geoffrey Masson, because of a breathtaking failure of courage in the face of the crushing and overwhelming reality of child abuse sanctioned by the patriarchal culture of his time. But others have argued that it was not a failure of courage to stand up to the hostility of his patriarchal colleagues, but rather that Freud and the materialism of his times were not able yet to formulate a sufficient concept of psychological reality to understand what trauma does to memory and cognition. I would put it differently and suggest that while it is true that the unconscious being discovered in Freud's time, the Tartarus to which Zeus had banished any knowledge of the crimes of incest and infanticide, was too dark and deep, too alien to patriarchal ideals and threatening to patriarchal power to become conscious. As one psychiatrist opined about a woman's accusations of incest against her father, who was described as a most honorable man, quote, "The enormity of the accusation destroys its probability. The very foundation of Western civilization, the durability and security or immortality of patriarchy's foundational truth, depends, as we have seen, on child sacrifice and the sacrifice of embodied, particularly feminine, ways of knowing and being." It's too bad we can't see, like, because of the little blocks of people, can't see that who they're looking at, this woman demonstrating hysteria for the great doctors in the theater of Charcot. To actually dismember the father's omnipotence by binding him to responsibility for his omnipotence creating acts was not possible in Freud's turn of the century European culture. Though psychoanalysis was indeed, as Mogensen says, Greg Mogensen, a rewriting of paralyzing events into experiences that let life go on, the life that was allowed to go on by means of adopting the, quote, psychoanalytic maxim that the patient is always lying, end quote, in the early days of psychoanalysis was that of the patriarch and hero. Hysterical women and children would continue to embody and bear as scapegoats the shadows of infantile need, hunger, rage, and lust of the patriarchal it, well into the 20th century. But who is the child that is guilty? If the child is archetypally speaking, as Jung says, the pre-conscious and post-conscious essence of humankind, end quote, all of psychology's imaginings about the psyche of the child are a kind of myth-making, just as any search for origins is, as Hillman tells us. Freud theorized an abstract, universal child with universal, literal, biological drives. But he was unwittingly speaking of the mythical or archetypal child, the divine child Dionysus, who is both parent to the adult as historical precedent psychologically, and child as potential future, as Dionysus is both the parent and the child of Zeus. Our source of life, our eternal emergence out of and return to mystery. The archetypal child is not an abstract. It only exists in and through this immanent, actual world unfolding through time, as Dionysus, the god of infinite life, streaming through all existence. In substituting a universal abstract child for actual traumatized children, Freud's child, like Oedipus, swallowed the reality and etiology of ancestral crimes and traumas, substituting for it a biologically inherited, generalized guilt involving faceless, patricidal hominids full of lust and aggression. That's from Freud's Totem and Taboo, where he theorized that the origin of the Oedipus complex was this band of hominid brothers who murdered their father to get access to his women in sometime in prehistory, which anthropologists just are completely dumbfounded that he could come up with such a story. In this way, Freud's universal abstract child becomes a kind of time capsule for the future, with a murder mystery inside that begins with an alibi. Psychology as a science of mind and psychoanalysis as a child of medical psychiatry, enlightenment, and romanticism was born in a net of psyche in which the entire rejected shadow of the ideal masculine hero and the weight of his, quote, his evil instincts and evil passions, as one psychiatrist said of children in 1882, was projected onto women and children. Freud, who opined that all psychology would ultimately be explained by biological processes, replaced sexual abuse and trauma, which he came to call accidental influences, with the idea that their passions and instincts and expressions of these were all caused by constitutional factors and organic repression. Thus, like the trauma victim carrying guilt as misunderstood etiology, assigning responsibility for traumata to his or her own character, for which punishment, atonement is due, women and children are especially marked by character, with the titanic crimes of hunger for communion with and in a divine cosmos. In the centuries between Sophocles and Freud, a story too long to tell here, this hunger of the body of God for the body of God became demonic and bestial. This is an example of what happened to Dionysus. As Dionysus is reduced to the bisexual goat god, the devil, and his theasos, or community of witches. Nietzsche named the witch's broth of primitive licentiousness and cruelty Dionysus, which Jung actually quotes him for that, and the principium individuationis Apollo. These masks removed them one step from the Judeo-Christian drama of Satan and Christ. And Freud further removed the abandoned body and the masculine hero from mythic and religious characters to wear masks made by science and biology, part of a process which Kirchner calls the conversion of a theodicy to a biodyssey. This translation maintains the left hemisphere's dualism of abstract and literal, the Orphic and Gnostic dualism of spirit and matter. Matter is spirit's evil imprisonment from which the masculine hero disembodies himself. And the abandoned body is now a medical specimen to be diagnosed, dissected, or analyzed as the divine child is cut up, imprisoned like the Titans, confined far below the earth, or perhaps electroshocked with Zeus's thunderbolt. Freud, in abandoning seduction theory, continued the reign of Zeus and Apollo, dismembering the human psyche and its world into an abstract theory and literal biology, and erasing history. Yet he also undermined that rule in three ways. First, he displaced the masculine heroic I, ego, as the center and sole arbiter of the self. Secondly, he made a bridge between fantasy and science with the idea that biology speaks to us in meaningful, albeit veiled, language. And thirdly, he established the monumental reality-making power of that which had over the centuries of Western patriarchy's development been cast into Tartarus, murdered over and over only to return in another form to challenge the ideal masculinized hero again and again. Tartarus was given a new name, the unconscious. The it, the id, which translates as it from German, dwells there, seething with infantile licentiousness, ravenous hunger, uncontrollable rage, and fantasies of omnipotence. The I, or ego, a marvel of civilization itself, slowly emerges out of the dark primitive mists of childhood. To control it, however, the hero I needs the super I, the super ego, with his thunderbolts of searing power and withering guilt. It, after all, could and would return and rise up at any time to wipe out the fragile treasure of I and its marvelous castle, Western civilization. Now here was a story we could understand. When we think of the evolution of psychology, we naturally think of books. Writers of psychology books often credit other books and writers of books for all the genius and authority written there, and the impact of being present with a suffering person has not often been remarked. It is implied in the power of the case history, reduced to writing, abstracted from the body of the suffering person, so its essence can become the currency of our enlightenment. And yet, it was in this intimate encounter of two people in a room that the holy rite of Dionysian theater was reborn, and the rites of initiation remembered. Initially, in the famous theaters of Mesmer and Charcot, where French peasant girls demonstrated hysteria for the good doctors, including Freud, the detached eye of distance was preserved, the duality of spectator and spectacle or specimen. Freud's method intended in part to preserve it with us laying on the couch and the therapist behind us not looking at us. But with the revolutionary displacement of the ego as the center of the psyche came the unmasking of the fiction of an ideal, separate, independent self to reveal a self constituted by and of relationship. In the mythic language of dreams, fantasies, symptoms, compulsions, slips of the tongue, we began to witness the chorus of the abandoned body's dances of its ancestral crimes, nightmares of traumatic fragmentation and dismemberment of who we really are in the country of myth, in the timeless time of the psyche. The abandoned body's knowledge, encoded as neurotic symptom and psychosis, depression, anxiety, speaks in the dragon's voices of all the gods and animals of us. The furies, shrieks of unredressed crimes of patriarchal power, the abandonment, persecution, torture, murder of the ecstatic, erotic, passionate gods and goddesses, theasos, collective embodiment. We are the living embodiment of our history. Our bodies did not forget how to enact the intricate and complete truths of our own ancestors, their crimes and their blessings. The body does not forget. And so the sufferers began to transform the drama of the play into a different kind of plot. And the masks of the characters began to change. Jung found discarded in the very center of the garbage pile of Freud's id images of divine wholeness, which he called the self. Then he formulated the archetype as a psychoid structure, non-structure, apparently rooted in an underlying unity, neither spirit nor matter, but somehow acting as both, outside our ability to know. In this way, Jung unmasked the fiction of duality and its lie as the foundation of reality. With the publication of psychological types, moreover, Jung displaced the discursive reasoning as the center of intelligence, just as Freud had displaced the I, ego, as the center of the self. Self-psychology, object relations, and attachment theory described the self-creating dance of attachment between mother and infant, evoked in the therapeutic relationship. The mythopoetic body became visible in active imagination, the play of enactments, and the therapist's reveries. Contemporary psychoanalysis and analytical psychology found in neuroscience a bridge to the intricate dance of ancestral trauma as biology. The theory of emergence as the unfolding of consciousness out of the vibrant co-constructive field between analyst and analysand further undermine our notions of ourselves and reality as separate atoms. Here we meet Faunus, whose name shares a root with epiphany and phenomena emerging from the cosmic egg. In other words, the dualistic, abstract, literal world of Zeus and the domination of the left hemisphere in defining reality has come to an end, and its source in a greater non-dual archetypal cosmos revealed. Though Freud's seduction theory was left to die like Oedipus, it did not. As our 20th century progressed, the imagined distance between doctor and patient, analyst and analysand, became a vibrant field of mutual transformation, in which the truth not only of sexual and physical trauma, but of less visible attachment trauma could unfold and be transmuted. This potent field of transubstantiation is the ancient Athenian theater of Dionysus. Here it is with me in it. I'm at the theater of Dionysus. It's an amazing experience. Each performance of which began with the sacrifice of a goat on an altar named compassion or pity. Its purpose, according to Aristotle, was a catharsis, a clearing up or clarification that is experiential, emotional, and cognitive, and that brings one to a state of truly knowing. Aristotle tells us that it is specifically suffering, compassion, and fear by which catharsis is accomplished. Excuse me. In-depth psychotherapy, catharsis is the moment of metanoia, when suffering transmutes into healing, meaning, grace. It is when a person, having dismantled or been stripped of defenses, and with the help of compassionate witnessing, has descended into the agonies of childhood trauma, transmuting events into experiences, grieved and remembered the dismembered child, and by what mysterious means we know not, has emerged, transformed, liberated from the clutch of the Furies. In the mysteries of Eleusis, this was the birth of new light in the divine child out of darkness. As we have seen earlier, the primary archetypal processes by which Zeus establishes and maintains power are fragmentation, splitting, banishment, swallowing into the unconscious, and scapegoating or projection of the unconscious onto others. In the reopening of Dionysus's theater, this primary process was reversed, and the revolution into a new age had its tender beginnings. While Freud helped open this transformative revolutionary space, he maintained the stance of the dragon-slaying hero. Quote, "Where id was, ego shall be." Jung, on the other hand, chose the path of the hero as initiate, a process that had been made largely obsolete in the age of Zeus. To enter the belly of the dragon, be dismembered, and reborn as a celestial human with the dragon's knowledge and power. Sophocles' last play, Oedipus at Colonus, shows us the path of suffering, atonement, and transfiguration taken by Oedipus, which resonates in important respects with that of Jung. We will turn now briefly to Jung's initiation to see these parallels before returning to Oedipus to glimpse our path to the future age. When Jung descended into his own darkness, he found also the collective darkness of impending war, the severed head of Siegfried, and rivers of blood. The beheading of the hero in his dream is paralleled by Jung's surrender of his ego and sacrifice of his intellectual knowledge to go in search of his soul, which he says he had lost. With the publication of the Red Book, we can now appreciate how profound a dismemberment by the powers of the unconscious his descent was, and how transformative for his whole life and work. Such a process is a return along our evolutionary path, an Ouroboros journey for the sake of rebirth in a divine cosmos. First, the uninitiated hero ego, puer aeternus, faces the great initiator, ruler of the age before Zeus, Colonus or Saturn. Jung is told that, quote, "sacrifice is the foundation stone of what is to come," end quote. Here, the reality of the psyche is encountered. The spirit of the depths tells Jung, "We are just as real as your fellow men. You invalidate nothing and solve nothing by calling us symbols." The journey takes us back further to our source in Faunus, Dionysus, and the cosmic egg. Jung, at the beginning of his journey as recorded in the Red Book, became a lion-headed man encircled by a serpent, Ion or Faunus Dionysus. This fantastical figure expresses human consciousness as a composite of our reptilian and mammalian, both herbivore and carnivore origins in the cosmic womb of Gaia. When the ideal human dismembers itself from this body, what remains is the dragon. Dismantling the grip of left brain dominance leads us into states of consciousness in which, as Jung discovered, we approach the pleroma. Its edge is the event horizon at the meeting of conscious and unconscious, the threshold of emergence of the phenomenal world, phanos emerging from the cosmic egg. One possible meaning of the root of the verb to initiate stems from the verb muing, to close the eyes or mouth. To initiate, we must give up day vision, life as usual, the self as we know it, and go into the dark. The impetus to do this is usually that life cannot go on any longer as it was. Jung undertook his journey recorded in the Red Book because he feared he would go mad. Similarly, when Oedipus decides to relentlessly pursue the truth of the curse on his land, it is because life has become unbearable in Thebes. Though he solved one riddle of the Sphinx, he had to go deeper to live out the riddle's tragic paradox and conflict of human being as four-legged animal, two-legged human, and three divine. The full realization that he himself was the source of plague and pollution on his land and people moves him to blind himself in rage and grief, giving up the power of vision for which he was known and his crown. He then entered the darkness that confronts us all when stripped of who we thought we were. Paradoxically, this darkness holds the key to inner sight. In Greek tragedy, old blind Tiresias, also descended from the Spartoi, was second only to the Delphic oracle as a source of knowledge of things unseen. And Oedipus presses him to disclose the truth that he knows. Listening to birds was one important source of his prophetic knowledge. The path of the initiate may become the path of the prophet, who has opened the portal of his or her own darkness into the lair of the dragon, who speaks in the voices of gods and animals, such as birds. Jung became such a prophet, as did old blind Oedipus, as we see in Sophocles' last play, Oedipus at Colonus. From other plays, we learn that after blinding himself and giving up rulership of Thebes, he is hidden in darkness, goes mad, and is finally exiled from Thebes and wanders homeless with his daughter Antigone, seeking asylum. I should mention that both Oedipus and Jung were haunted by ghosts, by the dead. When the play opens, Antigone has led her father to Colonus, site of a holy shrine to the Furies, and the threshold of Athens and of the underworld, where the Delphic oracle foretold he was to live his final days. It was also foretold that his burial site would bring blessing and protection to the land where he was buried, which tells us that he has become sanctified, the suffering hero who after his death should be the treasure and defense of those in whose land he found his rest. Here we have an echo of the burial of Dionysus at Delphi, where he is still alive and present though unseen, and also a remnant of the disappearing ages consciousness of the living connection between a sacred earth, the gods who embody that sacredness, and the heroes who achieve a holy power through their suffering that can be dedicated back to blessing the land. And of course, we see that this is the correlate to the beginning of Oedipus Tyrannus, where he is the source of curse on his land. So then in the mythopoetic world, everything is still absolutely connected, the earth to people, people to the earth. This final gift Oedipus can give is one of his principal concerns in the play and shapes the dramatic action, as his son and King Creon will come to Colonus and try to bring him back to Thebes for his blessings power to defeat their enemies. Their struggle and conflict illuminates the conflict of the transition to the age of Zeus, which is indeed our own critical conflict today. As Karl Reinhardt puts it, in Sophocles, drama comes more and more to mean the riddle of a man's inner conflict. Thus, the opposing parties are, on the one side, the individual human life, narrow and limited, uncommonly self-centered in its affirmations and denials, and on the other side, its involvement with the fate of the locality of the land, the power to bless or curse for all time, the obligation to guard and protect. This conflict is played out between Oedipus and Creon and between Oedipus and his son. We see it also in the contrast between King Theseus of Athens, who wisely gives Oedipus asylum and honors him as worthy of protection, and Creon and son, who only want Oedipus back for the boon of his gravesite to help them defeat their enemies. Oedipus, clear-seeing in his blindness, calls out their hypocrisy and gives his final blessing to the land of Theseus, precisely at the sanctuary of the Furies, with whom he has at last come to peace. He performs the sacred rites of libation to them, with instruction from the chorus. All of Oedipus's suffering and atonement for his own and his ancestors' crimes gives his performance of these rites a profound emotional power. This marks the transformation of the Furies, whose shrieking hounds from hell who avenge crimes against the mothers and the earth, into the Eumenides, the kindly ones. The rites also mark the metanoia that has occurred in Oedipus, the turning point when what has cursed the old self is transmuted into an ultimate blessing for the new. With Oedipus's performance of these rites, and with his final disappearance into the mystery of what lies beyond this realm, this last play of Sophocles, performed after his death and after the fall of Athens, has returned us to the sacred origins of Attic drama. Quote, an enactment of occult legend, the visible testimony and perception of a mystery, end quote. Oedipus's death is not portrayed on stage. What Theseus alone sees and learns from Oedipus is secret and remains so. And in this way, Sophocles, who believes in the miracle and mystery of Oedipus's manner of passing, quote, treats it with the awe and reverence he reserves for what is divine, end quote. It was said of the Eleusinian mysteries that in them one learned that death is not an evil, but something good. In Oedipus, then, we are shown something of what a blessed death is on the threshold of divine mystery. In this founding myth of psychoanalysis and of our time as told by Sophocles, a human king descended from the bringer of the alphabet embodies and plays out the violent story of the evolution of consciousness in this age of Zeus. This human king also shows us the path of the hero as initiate, opening the possibilities for our rebirth into the next Orphic age. In this age of Zeus, we swallowed the gods and ancestors into the unconscious, split ourselves in our world, the unus mundus, into a duality of abstract and literal, and installed an Apollonian abstract ideal of independent masculine power, an uninitiated puer aeternus as model for the ego, to rule the earth by means of scapegoating and unholy sacrifice of the embodied feminine children and the alien other, and the earth itself. What's happened to my, is that 72? Okay, my slides are all messed up, but that's all right. We'll just look at Godzilla for a while. We do not need to consult an oracle to know that our species is at a crossroads where life cannot go on as it has. Here I have tried to tell the shadow story to our usual narrative of the glories of Western civilization in progress, to emphasize the hidden costs to that progress, which have brought us to this crossroads. The nature of the development of consciousness in this age has given us the thunderbolt of Zeus and the eye of distance of Apollo, harnessed to Zeus's ruling principle of power. This has produced a kind of brilliant intelligence that endlessly fragments the world and the self into ever smaller bits for a never-ending expansion of power and technology, catapulting us through an industrial age, an atomic age, a digital age. But a darkness equal to that brilliance has also fallen on our origins as indissoluble parts of a unified field, the divine unus mundus. Our souls, the means we once had to remember the body of that wholeness, have become almost obsolete. Our blindness to the divinity of what we have sacrificed for the sake of power means an endless repetition compulsion of the roasting of the titans and the goddess, endless exploitation and destruction of everything we believe is not of us. The fiction of immortality means also an endless war on death itself as our enemy and our failure, not the sacred end that is part of every beginning in the holy renewal of earthly existence. The power to rule the earth has been ours, or has it? Haven't we, like Zeus, only deluded ourselves by swallowing the greater truth? Did Gaia and Rhea, who engineered the consciousness that started us down this road, intend this result? When Zeus raped his mother and daughter and roasted his lover, and Apollo took over the oracle at Delphi, was this a necessary development? Or did we become an experiment gone bad? The title of the play Oedipus Tyrannus contains an irony. A tyrant is one who did not inherit his crown, but obtained it by other means. Oedipus won his crown by guessing the Sphinx's riddle, though he was by birth the heir of Laius and the crown. Perhaps we have seized a power by force that was our inheritance to begin with, but which we have to lose after bringing plague and destruction in order to choose to be initiated into the truth of what that power really means, to ask whom the Grail serves. The father of psychoanalysis named the Oedipus complex the foundation of the human psyche. It took another half-century for the Laius complex to be named. Laius wanted to remain in power at all costs, including infanticide, and not suffer death. The dismantling of limits on human life and power at the cost of our future has been our project in this age. To become the astronaut ready to depart Earth, we have sacrificed our body of interconnection, our need and desire for communion in a divine cosmos that has been tortured, burned, raped, electroshocked, molested, gassed, drugged, hunted for sport, dissected, imprisoned, exploited, enslaved, starved, and colonized. It's hard to read that list of things. In these myths, we have met the split-off, scapegoated body of God as the immortal ashes and soot of the Titans containing the divine child, and as the celestial dragons speaking in the voices of all the gods and animals, whispering oracles from under the earth, the swallowed, degraded Phanes Dionysus. For the abstract independent hero, our dragons are an alien other that must be conquered and destroyed again and again. But dragons, like titanic soot, cannot die. When the dragon Godzilla, who was awoken by the atomic bomb, rose out of Tokyo harbor, he terrorized all of Tokyo until, dazed and howling in the electric wires, he was finally destroyed in his lair by a small, hard metallic ball containing, quote, the oxygen destroyer. Of course, Zeus is the element of air. Every ton of his raging prehistoric flesh atomized. I have wondered if perhaps the coronavirus is that atomic atomized dragon reborn from the seafloor of life, child of Gaia as all dragons are, degraded and dismembered into his tiniest particle, returned to us as our archetypal Satan, which is a word that once meant opponent, our holy mirror. Is this dragon particle called COVID-19 an agent of Gaia sent to unmask us, to reveal us to ourselves, with a plan to initiate a new age? Will we destroy it as another alien other without asking first who it is and what it has to say? Or will we enter its darkness to find its meaning as, like us, an indissoluble part of the divine unus mundus? Apollo and Dionysus have never been two gods. They are one Godhead, one prefrontal cortex, split into two by the great Gaia to help us awaken. The gods image to us a fundamental pair of forces in the observable universe. Forces that tend to coherence and unification, and forces that tend to incoherence and separation. In human consciousness, one holds our power to dismember us and our world to oblivion, down to splitting atoms, the ultimate power of Zeus to destroy. The other holds our means to remember who we are and what we mean in the entire cosmos from which the other was dismembered to rule. The breadth and complexity of consciousness that has evolved in us, in part thanks to alphabetic writing, is immeasurable. But Apollo has been killing off his brother, dragon Dionysus, for 3,000 years now, and Gaia is calling for a change. The age of Zeus is ending as it began, in endless war, as we roast our forests and boil our oceans, setting the world on fire without and within, denying our own death to the point of extinction. But what if power and freedom to do as we like without consequences, the power to remain a child, is not our highest purpose? Yet, if we forsake these for the sake of consciousness, we are then Oedipus, faced with having to sacrifice that power and atone for all the ancestral crimes committed for the sake of power and personal immortality. We are faced with dying to who we have been. We are faced with the ordeal of initiation. Our entire species is poised for initiation at every level: individual, collective, cultural, planetary. Life cannot go on as it is. A death is required, and the outcome is uncertain. The Orphics hinted at the possibility of a new age. In one story, Dionysus was crowned by Zeus as the ruler of the next age before he was roasted along with the Titans. Another story is that the great goddess of wisdom, Metis, who was reduced to the gut instinct when Zeus swallowed her, was pregnant with the child who might inherit the scepter of Faunus and the thunderbolt. That child is waiting to be born, is being born. in the meeting of the scapegoated, the persecuted, the wounded, the broken, and those who witness, who listen, who are willing to dismantle the delusions of power, dominance, and separateness, to end the age of Zeus. The divine child is coming to birth inside and among all of us, willing to take up the task of dying to who we have been for the possibility of rebirth, for the sake of the divine earth, our home and our body. In his 1948 essay, A Psychological Approach to the Dogma of the Trinity, Jung proposes 3 stages of human development, modeled on the Christian Trinity of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, describing a basic pattern of initial unity, a split into opposites, and reunification on a higher plane. The first stage of the Father, quote, is characterized by a pristine oneness with the whole of nature, far removed from critical judgment and moral conflict. That might be something roughly like our age of Gaia and Uranus. In the stage of the Son, which is our age of Zeus, explored here, an irreversible increase in consciousness takes place, creating a rational and reflective awareness, as well as, quote, many latent possibilities of dissociation, end quote, which is a conflict situation par excellence, and brings a sharpening of opposites, in particular of moral opposites. All those are Jung's words. The third stage, the age of the Holy Spirit, is a resolution of the polarity of ego and unconscious and reconciliation of the first 2 stages at a higher level, a rebirth of the unity of the Father stage with retention of the individual faculties of reason and reflection. Quote, this third stage means articulating one's ego consciousness with a superordinate totality of which one cannot say that it is I, but which is best visualized as a more comprehensive being. Just as the transition from the first stage to the second demands the sacrifice of childish dependence, so at the transition to the third stage, an exclusive independence has to be relinquished. Our great task, then, is to dethrone our uninitiated, omnipotent, childlike egos, and to take our place in the divine cosmos and on the divine earth. It is our Ouroboros journey to remember who our parents are, earth and starry heaven. They have never forgotten us, for we have always been part of them, and our souls have never, could never forget how to lead us to them. Thomas Berry tells us, the new cultural coding that we need must emerge from the source of all such codings, from the revelatory vision that comes to us in those special psychic moments or conditions that we describe as dream. Not only as the psychic processes that take place when we are physically asleep, but also intuitive, non-rational processes that occur when we awaken to the numinous powers ever present in the phenomenal world around us, powers that possess us in our high creative moments. In moments of confusion such as the present, we are not left simply to our own rational contrivances. We are supported by the ultimate powers of the universe as they make themselves present to us through the spontaneities within our own beings. End quote. But the question is, are we making time to listen to these spontaneities, these dreams? What has become of time? Our Ouroboros journey to find our parents leads us to remember and reclaim time, Kronos and his wife, Rhea, the flowing one. In our world that has lost its soul, time that was once a medium of our own unfolding has become instead our enemy, a bully, as the late Irish poet and philosopher John O'Donoghue tells us. Our body souls know this disturbed relation to time as stress. which, he says, is a perverted relation to time. Rather than relate to time as a commodity, as blocks in a day planner, we must reclaim our ability to experience time as the mother of presence. To do this, we must dive down into the slower world of spirit time, where things behave differently, where we find that possibility is the secret heart of time. On its outer surface, time is vulnerable to transience, but in its deeper heart, O'Donoghue suggests, time is transfiguration, where things can change very quickly. When we connect with the earth we live upon, with our landscape, with all our relations, with our bodies, with the sky at night, our hearts find the rhythm of the universe. As Aphrodite was born of the seed of the starry heavens and the oceanic depths where life was born, beauty and love teaches us who we are and what is truly of value. We might learn to listen to our soul's desire to say, spend time with a friend, or dance in our living room, or lie down with our eyes closed and listen to music, rather than watch Netflix. We each might dethrone Zeus's power principle so that we can, the idea that we can do whatever we want, whenever we want, and it doesn't matter to the universe, and begin one decision at a time to restore Thebes and Dike, the law of the integrity of the universe. As Thomas Berry expresses it, the law that every component member of the universe should be integral with every other member of the universe, and that the primary norm of reality and of value is the universe community itself in its various forms of expression, especially as realized on the planet Earth. How would our lives change if we were to really understand that every moment of our lives is integral to the well-being of the earth and indeed the universe? What would happen if we were to actually dethrone Zeus in our own psyche? What would it be like for us to realize that when Jung said, the world hangs by a slender thread, and that thread is the psyche of man, he meant you and I, not the sociopaths at the top of the 1%, but us. Could we imagine this together? And can we start right now? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frances. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Well, we'd like to open it up again to questions and comments and discussion. And again, if you would use the either the reaction to raise your hand or type in the question in the chat. Thank you.
Georgina asks, is it possible to send us a PDF or notes or outline to help us connect the dots along this river? Just keep up the family tree of Greek genealogy. Just to keep up with the family tree of Greek genealogy is vast, let alone the nature of relationships. Wonderful presentation.
Well, Georgina, I see that you have the genealogy right there, and it is ungodly confusing because there's so many different, right? Yeah. Well, I first want to say your body has recorded this whole presentation. And if I had any dear, dear desire It's that you allow yourself time for your body to think it over, to absorb it. I did publish a paper in the Jung Journal, which I will put the link to. Let's see, I think if I put the link in, they'll want to make you pay for it. But anybody who would like the paper, I don't want to send it to every single person because I might get in trouble with the publisher of the journal. But if you would just email me your email address, and I will put my email address in here, and I will send you the paper. But don't tell Taylor and Francis. I don't believe they ought to be making all that money off of my paper. But anyway, I'm happy to share that paper. It's not going to have how I rhapsodize about Earth and you know, it doesn't have a whole lot of the juicy stuff, but it has the main dense argument text stuff.
Well, and everyone's going to get a recording of this presentation, so you'll be able to see it again, which,
Oh, yes.
yes.
Say,
So
Siri, transcribe this. And you'll have the PDF, right?
Okay, so the recording, excuse me, I unmuted myself. The recording is visual and audio.
correct. It's a video recording of the whole Zoom webinar.
Okay, and can I have one more moment with Francis, please?
And who's talking?
That would be Georgina.
Okay, thanks, Georgina.
Okay, Francis, I've been hideously sort of struck with what's going on in the Ukraine, and somehow I've really embraced, you know, everybody is my sister and brother in the family of man. And part of that came from when I first created an astrology chart to figure out who I was at age 12 or 13. I have Jupiter, okay, ruled by Zeus at the bottom of my chart in the third house, fourth house cusp. And I've always thought, well, that helped me to embrace the world as my family.
Mhm.
But now I'm looking at it as another level of truth. Zeus managed to also contribute to blowing up my family, given the nature of my family, which I won't bore everybody with the details.
Yeah.
So for what it's worth, I just keep an eye on Zeus or Jupiter. And that's all I wanted to share, really.
Well, you know, you bring up a really interesting point, which is that the translation from Greek into Roman deities isn't exactly, especially when you get to Zeus and Jupiter.
Okay.
And Jupiter is a beneficent is a beneficial planet in traditional astrology. Zeus and the power principle, I don't know what to say about how that shadow side, it is a kind of shadow side of Jupiter, in that Jupiter is very expansive and it wants more and more and more. But in the traditional astrology, that Jupiter really has a lot more in common with, say, Ganesha in Indian astrology. You know,
Okay.
it's big, but it's good, you know?
That's some relief. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. But you know, the discovery of the outer planets opened us into a new intensity of the opportunity and the burden, the responsibility of becoming conscious.
Thank you.
And that, you know, those people are our people. They're our neighbors. They're our friends. You know, when a couple of weeks ago, I went to the Albuquerque Symphony performing, I thought it was going to be Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto, which I love, and it always makes me cry. But I didn't realize when I got the tickets that, you know, the Ukraine thing wasn't even happening. But it was a Ukrainian pianist, and he changed the program. And at first I was mad. I was like, how can you take away? I mean, I came all the way from Santa Fe to here, but he changed it to, he played some Prokofiev, Prokofiev was born in Eastern Ukraine. Some beautiful pieces of Prokofiev. And then he played the last 3 sections of Pictures in an Exhibition by Mussorgsky. Mussorgsky was Russian, but the last of those pieces is called The Great Gates of Kiev. And it is an incredibly powerful piece. And it was originally written as a solo piano piece. And when this Ukrainian, I mean, I can't imagine that everybody in the audience wasn't just crying their eyes out. I was crying my eyes out because he was playing this piece with all the intensity and the passion that just opened up our hearts to his anguish and his rage and his grief. And it just really shook me to the core. And yeah, I'm shivering too. It's still with me. I still get that in my head when I'm the last part of the Great Gates of Kiev. When I'm thinking about them, I think of it as kind of being a vehicle for praying for them now, because the music was such a gift to convey all that to us.
Yeah. We keep thinking of Mr. P as a toxic narcissist, but actually the word sadist came to my mind, which is what makes any chance of negotiating such a challenge.
And the ability to delude. Yeah, thank you, Georgina.
I was thinking about when you were, your slide of the COVID molecule, and you were talking about the whole kind of paternal power over principle. COVID is like a power under. It dominated the world. It's been dominating the world for these past couple of years. And it's not a power over. It's passed person to person. It's a power. It's a power under. And it's so far more profound in a way. Whatever your experiences are with have been this past couple of years, it's much more profound than this kind of Putin drama that we're currently in. And it's nature. The virus is nature. It's Mother Nature. It's the related principles of Mother Nature, which caused us to slow down, at least for a while, and go more inward, relate to our pods, and do less. We all had to do less and figure out new ways to do things. We had to reinvent our world and our lives over these past couple of years. And, it was not exactly fun, but that was nature. That was the mother principle.
Yeah.
That just came into my mind earlier when you were talking about, the power of the power principle. We always I think about that as kind of the power over, but there's this other power.
Yeah. And it always seems so impossible for us to slow down and live life differently. It still seems impossible, but this is a little bit of Gaia saying, he who doesn't not heed shall be made to feel.
We've all felt a lot,
Yeah.
We felt lonely, we felt lost, all kinds of things.
Yeah, I think part of our problem is that it's so much easier in this age of Zeus to think of something than to actually do it. And again, it's that idea that there's no consequences. There's no consequences. We can do it however we like, but if we think good thoughts or thoughts about doing it differently. That kind of serves for doing it differently, and it doesn't. We actually would have to change, each of us, not the guys at the top, us. You know, how would we do that? Which of course is an individual thing between each of us and our souls. You know, Jung said over and over at the beginning of the Red Book that this is your path, but it's not everybody's path. Everybody has their own path. Everybody, the way is within us, not in God's, nor in teaching, nor in laws. Within us is the way, the truth, and the life. Of course, that didn't stop him from, you know, liking to tell people to go make their own Red Book, but we really do have to have it out with our own souls. There isn't a like, well, sign on to this cause, or, you know, not that we shouldn't, but there's not a collective answer. There's individual soul answers, I think. And if individuals are in tune with their souls, they'll know what to do. Because they'll be in tune with the universe, and the universe will be talking to them. But when it really gets to the rubber meeting the road, like, you know, I mean, for me, it's a slow daily work of gradually doing more of what my soul wants and less of what my ego wants to rebel and do whatever it wants says. You know, like going to bed at a certain time helps me dream better. Eating in a certain way helps me dream better. Having a meditation practice helps me open to silence better. You know, there are those things that we are capable of doing. And to me, those are the essence of it. Because I don't really have faith in the collective much anymore, really.
Comment from Marjorie Runyon. I am shivering. If anyone is interested in the heroine's journey, the Tao of Twins, the heroine's journey, perhaps Antigone.
Yes, Antigone. Antigone is the third of the 3 plays that Sophocles wrote about the Oedipus myth. It's a very powerful play. And it's, you know, the heroine who's defying the order of Creon to bury her brother, her dead brother. And what happens to her in that defiance. And the remembering the dead and honoring the dead. It's a huge piece of this dismantling of the age of Zeus, like in, to jump a few thousand years, in the Hunger Games. When in the first movie of the Hunger Games, then Katniss undermines the rule of the patriarch, the president, by first of all doing rites for the dead, you know, the person who became her kind of friend, she put flowers over her and took time to have a little ritual and ceremony for her. And that was one of the things that just made people wild. And when she did that, you knew that she had trumped him, so to speak. That in the reverence for the dead and the reestablishing of our deep interconnection with each other in community, she was defying the rule of that patriarch.
I see Marjorie, you have your hand raised. If you'd like to speak, go ahead. Oh, you just muted yourself. So hit that again and then you'll be able to. There you go.
And Antigone also spoke truth to power. Very important role that she played.
Yeah, and it was a very specific truth about connection, about the importance of respectful rights for the dead.
Yes, and she was willing to die for her truth. And in some ways, we need to die to the old story, as you've been saying. What a beautiful presentation. I'm so grateful.
You're so welcome. I'm so grateful. I mean, when I talk about how Oedipus, chose Freud, well, this Orphic cosmogony chose me like decades ago. And I've been living inside it for a long time. So, and I really have been needing to share this. And I so appreciate this opportunity. And so appreciate all of you with your fabulous questions.
Well, on behalf of all of us, I thank you for collecting, for doing the deep dive, for correlating all these ideas and images, beautiful images, as well as your own ideas, and sharing them with us in a very warm and related way. Very nicely done and very meaningful. So thank you very much, Frances.
Thank you, Rich.
And thank you, Lisa Pounders, for you and all you do. And thanks to all of you for coming out and coming out here into cyberspace, I guess, and sharing this morning with us all. And I really am moved by it all. Yeah. So we'll see you next month if you choose to come. I hope you do. And